Um, I don't think Russia is too afraid of what Israel can deliver. You have had some Israeli politicians say, we have to take care of our immediate neighborhood right now, and then we're going to deal with you, Russia. So that will be interesting to watch. But look, we all know that Russia is heavily sanctioned, so is Iran. They both need each other desperately, and Russia does have the nuclear technology. It's building a nuclear reactor, possibly two, in Turkey right now, earning billions of dollars. So uh, Russia is not in a good state economically. I think it could probably think up of great barter deals to do with Iran to give them more access to nuclear technology, in return get the resources that it needs, especially to press ahead with its war in Ukraine.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we are talking to a Ukraine-based global affairs analyst with more than 2 decades experience in humanitarian work and international journalism. Michael Bociurkiw is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and has been a spokesman for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's also an author and a regular commentator for many international media outlets. Michael, great to see you again on Frontline. Thank you very much for your time. Let's start. You are a resident of Odessa, and let's start with that because it seems that Russia has been stepping up its ballistic missile attacks there. A foreign flagged container vessel, now the third, I think, struck in 4 days. Can you tell us a bit more about what's going on here and the timing of it?
Sure, great to be with you again. Yeah, it's really crazy. I mean, I don't remember a time when so many foreign flag vessels have been hit in Odessa. Let's remind everyone at the start that Odessa is a world port. It feeds the world. A lot of the grain, a lot of the sunflower oil that comes through there goes to a lot of deprived economies, deprived nations, especially in Africa. And the last one to be struck was actually a container vessel, which is interesting, Kate, because in the past weeks, I've noticed from my walks along the port is they've been gearing up to restart container traffic from Odessa port. And I think this was one of the first vessels to come to collect containers. And this is really important because it will relieve potentially the traffic on Ukrainian roads and on Ukrainian trains and ship it back to sea where most of it should be. And then previously vessels that were supposed to be carrying grain were also hit. And then also in the past, grain storage facilities, that sort of thing. So a real setback, and this is above and beyond the city and the region of Odessa being hit quite hard in the past while. I don't know what the end strategy is with Russia on this one, but you know, I'm not hearing the complaints or the anger from the major capitals, and we're not seeing the amount of muscle, not even a fraction, being deployed by the West into the Black Sea to protect these ships from being hit. So I think it's something that Western leaders need to start thinking about.
I mean, just wondering how well defended Odessa is in particular against these kind of attacks.
Well, I mean, I think the air defense systems have been quite improved over the past months. I mean, I can tell from living there that we do receive less strikes overall. The air defense systems are able to bring down the missiles and the drones before they hit. But I think the strategy of Russia, who knows, maybe they're learning from the bad actors elsewhere in the Middle East, is to overwhelm the air defense system. So you see a mix of ballistic missiles and drones at the same time. And then you also see, not only in Odessa, but elsewhere in Ukraine, kind of swarms of drones all coming at once, but then changing course, not only putting the entire country on the alert, but also confusing defense systems. And that has had some success as well. So what Mr. Zelensky and others are pleading for more air defense systems to protect cities of Odessa. And again, it is a world port. It's a crucial part of the global food supply chain. Why not giving more protection? But of course, the other thing that's needed is permission for Ukraine, and we'll probably be getting to this, but to strike at those back bases in Russia where these missiles are coming from, but that permission hasn't come yet.
Yeah, indeed, and I will ask you a bit more about that in a moment. Just in terms of the ground war at the moment, the think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, reports that the Russian military command has likely ordered significant tactical advances on the battlefield before poor weather conditions set in. And there's corresponding increase in the use of armoured vehicles in the Kharkiv and Pokrovsk directions. What can you tell us about their progress and their objectives?
It's really difficult to put the entire picture together because it is a very, very long front line, and you have different tactics and activities going on. And let's not forget, we also have a lot of elite Ukrainian troops and units on Russian territory right now in Kursk, manning that incursion. But what has happened recently, which should be of concern to everyone, is Russia has gained ground. Vuhledar, which sits quite high and is quite strategic, was recently overtaken by the Russians, even though it cost them a lot in terms of men, and this is happening along the front line in terms of military vehicles. They continue to push on. Why? Because they have the numerical advantage. But what seems to not have happened, which gives Russia advantage along the front line, is that incursion into Kursk did not divert a lot of manpower, Russian manpower, from the front line, from Donetsk, for example. In fact, one study group says that after the Kursk incursion, the Russians have gained more ground in 2 months since 2022, which is astounding because, again, that was a big strategic objective of the Kursk incursion, to divert Russian resources from the front line.
And it's interesting, though, because even though you say it didn't divert great numbers of troops from the front line, the numbers of losses in terms of armoured vehicle and men are substantial along those parts of the front line, aren't they? And Russia seems at the moment to be able to sustain it. But the question is, how long will they be able to sustain that for?
Well, some analysts give Russia another year or two before it's going to be very difficult for them to sustain it. But having said that, if we're to believe Mr. Putin, Russia is on a military footing. It's transformed the economy into a war economy. And on top of that, we mustn't forget that it has a lot of bad actors helping it. Iran is now reported to be sending medium range missiles to Russia. It has the assistance of North Korea. And of course, Iran is also sending those very, very destructive drones to Russia. And we're also reading reports that in the background, China is supporting. You have China and India buying oil and other resources from Russia, which in turn helps to support its war economy, its war machine. So it's hard to say. One would have thought that by this point, given the number of Russian losses, you would have had a lot more Russian families, a lot more Russian mothers getting up and saying, enough is enough. We don't want our men either coming back in boxes or badly injured. But that doesn't seem to have happened yet. So to answer your question in a few words, then it looks like Russia can keep at this for quite some time, especially, by the way, without a solid domestic opposition and free media, too.
On the political front and the money front, good news for Ukraine in that the EU has got around any blockages by Hungary to give the go-ahead for 35 billion euros to be loaned to Ukraine using frozen Russian assets. What can you tell us about the terms of this deal and how the money will be used and when exactly?
Still in the works, but it's very, very good news. The EU leadership has worked very hard to get this done. Yes, you're right, referencing the frozen Russian assets. If I'm not mistaken, it's actually going to be the interest from these frozen Russian assets that are going to help repay this loan. The reason the principle isn't being used is because the EU or the money people in the EU feel that it will give the bloc a bad reputation, whatever that means. The other kind of aspect of this, which I don't think has been worked out yet, is for the US to come into this arrangement. It's also insisting that EU member states extend sanctions against Russia for a long, long time further. as you well know, and your listeners, the political landscape in Europe is shifting quite a bit right now. France, Germany, I think even in the UK, leaders there that are known to be very pro-Ukrainian aren't on a very solid political ground right now. And of course, very, very loud ticking in the background is the political clock in the United States. We're counting down the days to November, where if Mr. Trump does get in, he pledges to, quote unquote, end this war very quickly, maybe before even inauguration. And that would be a deal that would not be in Ukraine's favor.
Yeah, and just in that light, President Zelensky, he seems to be doing a tour right now
Yeah.
in Europe, and he's due to meet the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the new Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, in London as part of this tour. You were there at the UN General Assembly in the US, and when he presented the victory plan to the current and prospective presidents of the United States. Do you feel now that he senses he is in a race against time to secure support?
Well, let me be very blunt with you. I just spoke about this at the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong, and I put it very plain to everyone there. I said the recent trip by Mr. Zelensky to the UN, to Washington, and that trip to Pennsylvania was a disaster. He had a victory plan, which we're still waiting to hear the full details about, but it's been panned by critics as kind of a repackaging of a previous peace plan. And then at the start of his visit, he came saying that there's new Ukrainian intelligence indicating that Russia is poised to attack the 4 nuclear power plants in Ukraine. We haven't seen much above and beyond that. And I think that the whole effort was undermined by the recent pushing out, sacking, whatever you want to call it, of Foreign Affairs Minister Dimitri Kbaev, who is very, very widely respected in the West and was said to have been actually on the verge of getting the West to agree to give Ukraine more strike range for those missiles. So now what's happening is I think there's a sense of desperation. There's an odd kind of narrative being penned by the Zelensky team on demands from the West that I don't think is as kind of punchy and articulate as we've heard previously. I don't want to attribute all of this to Mr. Kuleba leaving, but something is going on that they seem to not be gaining the ground that they once had. But Mr. Zelensky and his team well know that, yes, the political clock is ticking very loudly, and that they have, and as I mentioned, the political ground in Europe is shifting, and they have to be very quick to be able to get what they're asking for. And then primarily, again, permission to get more funding, more backing, more ammunition, and more strike capability to hit deeper into Russia. But of course, the other thing in the background in Europe and closer to you is that a lot of ammunition stocks in Europe have been depleted. There aren't many Patriot missile systems to go around. There's a lot that Ukraine needs that just is not in their warehouses, and that points to a lot of neglect and lack of, I think, dedication to up military budgets in the past years.
And just on that subject of the visit to London, we are unlikely to hear much more about any private conversations or anything about private conversations that President Zelensky has in London about those permissions on the use of long-range Storm Shadow missiles for strikes deep into Russia. How long do you think it is before Ukraine just goes ahead and does it anyway?
Well, you're right. We're not hearing much. We probably won't hear much, and that's, I think, the only reason people like me miss the administration of Boris Johnson, because it had a lot of leaks all the time and you found out what was going on behind closed doors. Having said that, I think what's going to happen here, and again, I said this in Hong Kong, is that the United Kingdom, France, who jointly produced the Storm Shadow missiles, will quietly go ahead, I think, and give Ukraine permission to use these missiles deeper into Russian territory with kind of the quiet okay or acquiescence of Washington. Let's not forget, Biden is a lame duck president. The Harris campaign is a very tight race with Mr. Trump. I don't think they want to risk anything right now to give Trump another political stick to hit them with to get too involved in this. So I think you're going to see a quiet okay. I don't know if we could see Ukraine going ahead on its own, given that the use of these missiles are quite reliant on Western kind of infrastructure support, that sort of thing.
Yeah, good point. Just on the point, of Zelensky's recent trip to the US, which you say was a disaster. How secure do you think his position is now, and how strong is the confidence in him at home and abroad? I mean, you've been at the moment you're in the middle of a sort of a world tour where you've been sort of engaging a public and giving, informing in various very informed circles about the situation. What is your reading?
Well, I think his reputation is slipping, but I think. In a way, he reminds me of my own Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, where his popularity is actually higher overseas than it is at home. But I think the frustration, Kate, with a lot of Ukrainians right now, those who I've talked to, is that they just don't feel they're being well informed by the Zelensky administration. I have not met one Ukrainian person in Ukraine, or even among those who have sought asylum, safer ground, not one tells me they understand why Ukraine went into Kursk. They haven't seen much benefit come from that. The other thing that's happening, which is going to, I think, strike at Mr. Zelensky's popularity, and let's not forget, even before the war, it was falling, is the coming winter. And why aren't the alarm bells going on in terms of what the worst case scenarios are in terms of the power and heating situation? With 80% or so of thermal generating capacity gone, and a lot of the other sources of energy gone because of Russian missile strikes, the scenarios for the coming winter are very, very bleak. We're hearing up to 18 hours a day in some regions without power, and that could also trigger, and of course this is going to be of concern to Europe and immediate neighbors like Moldova and Poland, that up to 5-6 million people could leave Ukraine this winter if it goes into that worst case scenario.
Just anecdotally, do people say when you're at home? Do people say that to you, that they're considering leaving? And what kind of anecdotally are you getting from the people that you talk to?
Well, what we saw this summer when the peak of the outages were happening, we had more hours of the day without power than with. Now, of course, it's easier to cope in hot weather than it is in sub-zero. As I said the other day, and it's in the hands of Mother Nature right now. It depends what kind of winter will be delivered. If it is that typical Northern European sub-zero temperatures, Ukraine is going to be in very, very big trouble. The United Nations, which has a pretty good ear to the ground in Ukraine, has said another humanitarian disaster could hit. But there just isn't the pace of reconstruction for many, many reasons that puts Ukraine on a more secure footing, energy-wise. And the other thing that's happening, which is a very weird development on the Zelensky side, is we're seeing more, I think, kind of self-inflicted pain. And what I mean by that, or self-inflicted damage, rather, what I mean by that, just around the time of Mr. Kuleba being pushed out, the head of Ukrenergo, the state-owned power generating company, was ushered out as well. And this was against the wishes of major backers of Ukraine. And it also caused a lot of people to be upset in Ukraine because this chap was responsible for hardening a lot of the power stations, substations against Russian missile attacks. And he also turned around the power company to actually make a profit. I am told from my sources that, like in the case of Mr. Kuleba, he was perhaps getting too visible, too influential, and then this does not sit well with people like the head of the presidential administration, Andriy Yermak, where under him there seems to be a kind of real centralization of power. So you put all of those factors together, and it's a bit of a mess right now, sad to say.
Just can I ask you? I know that you know Dimitri Kbaev. He's a friend, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Have you been able to, or are you able to disclose any conversations you've had since the foreign minister lost his job?
We haven't been in touch. He's been keeping quite a low profile, and it's kind of a tradition of Ukrainian foreign ministers to not criticize the new incoming person or to criticize those who came before. And I totally understand. I mean, Mr. Kuleba, he lives and breathes diplomacy. His father was a diplomat. And but what he did tell us in our podcast before the war was that he basically had three objectives for the foreign ministry. One was to achieve parity in the number of male and female Ukrainian ambassadors, and indeed, in the first year and a half, the Ukrainian number of Ukrainian female ambassadors went from 4 to 14, quite the accomplishment. Secondly, he wanted to professionalize the ministry quite a bit further, and I think he achieved that. And then thirdly, he wanted to show the world what great fighters Ukrainians are and to bring peace to Ukraine. And unfortunately, that legacy won't be achieved. But couldn't be a kind of worse step for the Zelensky administration to get rid of him at this time, because he was so well respected. He was so articulate. And I think his absence also, again, was to blame a bit for the fiasco in the United States. For example, that trip to the munitions factory in Pennsylvania, only having Democrats surrounding him. What that led to is the Zelensky team stepping on some very, very hot political embers in the midst of an election campaign in the U.S.
I spoke to a defense editor about 10 days ago, who actually said with President Zelensky, they were forecasting he might not last much beyond Christmas as president. I mean, is that the kind of thing that's being talked about in Ukraine?
I haven't heard that, and I doubt that. I think he's good to go probably well into next year. Let's remind everyone that when he was campaigning, he did pledge to be a one-term president, but of course, because of the war, martial law, it's just not feasible. It's not possible to have elections right now. But I think, you know, he has an incredible kind of stock of energy. And right now, as you mentioned, he's on this, you know, visit to the UK and then a European tour of capitals. And, you know, that's very, very admirable. Let's not forget how he started, where he came from. He was basically a television comedian. And he stepped up to this job very quickly. We all remember his famous line at the beginning of the war where, you know, the West reportedly offered him to evacuate him from Ukraine. He said, well, I don't need a one-way ticket. I need ammunition. So, you know, he's doing, there's no training that one can get to be a wartime president. And I think of all the other potential leaders around, no one can step up to the plate like he has. And also, I have to say that I don't see anyone being groomed or any kind of succession plans in the background happening. Again, there's a war going on. But I think he's going to be good to go for well into next year.
Looking forward to the future, central to Ukraine joining NATO and the EU is sorting out what's been years of endemic corruption in the country. It is rolling out this anti-corruption program with more than 1,000 measures signed off. How much difference do you think that will make?
Well, it's all in the practice, the delivery on the ground. I don't know how many of your viewers or listeners saw this, but Singapore just threw a minister into prison for relatively light corruption, I would say, because there's zero tolerance for that. In Ukraine, you can still say 20 million or divert 20 million in aid that's supposed to go to the front line, and maybe you'll get 12 years in prison. Well, excuse me, but that's not much of a deterrent. So until those types of stiff Singaporean-like penalties come into play, corruption will thrive. It is thriving. I hear a lot of stories of stuff just being diverted. And, you know, Mr. Zelensky once floated the idea that if you do this during wartime, it should be much, much more than a prison sentence. And he's not saying a public execution, but that's the kind of deterrence that needs to be vetted out. The other thing I've consistently said since the start of the war is just because you're under attack from Russia does not give you a pass to drop your war against corruption either. Why do I say that? Is because unless Ukraine cleans up its act and clamps down on this corruption, a few things aren't going to happen. Number one, those millions of Ukrainians, especially the young ones who fled Ukraine, are not going to come back because they just don't want to come back to a corrupt Ukraine. And then, of course, secondly, the big one is it's going to lengthen that timeline of Ukraine joining the EU, potentially joining NATO. Um, it's really got to tackle this in ways that isn't just new laws or promises on paper, but actually the delivery on the ground. People being thrown behind bars or worse for stealing from the military, for stealing humanitarian aid, for giving men fake documents to sneak out of the country instead of staying and being mobilized.
Yeah, I mean, the Times newspaper has written about a provincial government official in the last few days who's been charged with illicit enrichment during an investigation into false disability registration to evade military service. I mean,
Yeah.
when you read the story, it describes a situation where £5 million was stuffed into every wardrobe and drawer in this particular apartment when it was searched, and money being thrown in sort of holdalls out the window. I mean, it beggars belief almost. That it sounds incredible and demonstrates the scale of the problem.
Yeah, and a few weeks ago I was in Kiev, and one of the taxi drivers I was traveling with, we were talking about the war and going to fight, and he's as patriotic as you'll find. But then he points to outside the window and goes, "Look at all these new cars. Look at all this money sloshing around in Kiev. Am I going to go to the front line to defend these types of guys who are stealing?" Now, let's be clear. I mean, this isn't everywhere, and I don't want people to bite the hook of the Trump propaganda narrative and say, Ukraine is corrupt, Zelensky is corrupt. No, not at all. But that's one of the narratives that Ukraine has to get out, is that this is what Ukraine offers to the West. This is what we're doing to fight corruption. These are who the Ukrainian people are. They're great people, and they're very innovative, and they will be a plus to Europe, not a negative. And the other reason this narrative has to get out even better is because in my visit to the United States recently, you do hear a lot of stories that why should we be sending aid or military equipment to Ukraine because it's all going to be stolen? Well, one of the answers to that should be is that a lot of this money is actually staying in the U.S., creating jobs, creating wealth, and it's not being loaded onto pallets and being sent to Ukraine. It's actually staying in the United States.
And also key to getting the narrative out and getting to the truth of the situation is having good journalists. And I know that you are a member of the Ukrainian Journalists Association of North America.
Mm-hmm.
And you came up with this manifesto alongside other Ukrainian journalists
Yeah.
that said that of all the tens of billions that will go to rebuilding Ukraine in the future, not 1 cent should go until investment is put into the Ukrainian media sector. Can you explain why you see this as so important to the future of the country?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It's very important to look. I've attended at least two reconstruction or rebuilding summits, one in London and recently the one in Berlin, and not one word about how we can help to revive the Ukrainian media sector, which has been battered very badly. Deaths of journalists, injuries of journalists sent to the front line or volunteering, and many having gone abroad for safer ground. So there's a very big lack of talent right now. One of my friends produces the award-winning investigative TV program in Ukraine called Schem or Schemes. She says she can't hire an investigative journalist. And there are other similar problems at other outlets too. A lot of newsrooms have been destroyed. So what our argument is that yes, of the tens or hundreds of billions that are being pledged to Ukraine right now, not 1 cent should go in until millions that are needed by the media sector to rebuild are actually, pledged and given. And I think, this will take also the help of other media institutions around the world to help colleagues in Ukraine rebuild. The second kind of aspect of all of this is that I mentioned that hundreds of Ukrainian journalists have understandably fled to Europe and North America for asylum purposes. And recently at our journalist conference in New York, we had the head of the editor of Ukrainska Pravda, who I regard as kind of the dean of journalists in Ukraine. And I put it to her very bluntly. I said, do you think that we should be prepared to fund a Ukrainian media in exile, given what's going on in Ukraine right now, given the course of the war? And she said, yes, absolutely. So recently at an Atlantic Council panel in New York, the discussion there was about, the discussion there was about media in exile from Afghanistan, from Iran, from Russia, from Belarus. And I brought up the situation here of Ukrainian journalists, and a couple of the reporters on the panel said, that's a great idea that we start kind of encouraging these different exiled media groups to work together. And, if we get proper funding, not only could they send the news back home to their respective countries, but perhaps they could also be reporting on other issues as well, so that we get kind of their different perspectives, their different insight, and not lose that kind of brain trust, that talent. So a couple of really, really interesting ideas there, and I hope that it gets out further and that people step up and pledge to support that.
Certainly an interesting idea, and I look forward to seeing how that progresses and maybe catching up with you another time about that.
Sure.
We are speaking ahead of President Putin's unscheduled meeting with the Iranian president in Turkmenistan in response to the crisis in the Middle East, and they're also due to meet again on the sidelines of the annual BRICS Economic Group Summit. How do you think Russian-Iranian relations will be affected by the conflict in the Middle East at the moment?
Well, that's a very, very good question. We have to remind everyone of the support Iran has given to Russia in this war in particular, especially those drones. And we're not quite sure what Russia is offering in return, but suggestions are satellite technology, perhaps assistance with their own nuclear program. So there's quite a robust two-way street there. But, the way things are going right now, the Iranian regime has been quite weakened. And I think Ukraine would also be in favor of some kind of harsher action being taken against the regime, because not only are they providing those drones, if U.S. intelligence is to be believed, they're also going to start supplying these shorter and medium range missiles too. So, but this should be a reminder of the types of friends that Putin keeps, not only the Iranians, but also the North Koreans and other bad actors. Look at the activities of Kremlin-linked groups in Africa, propping up horrific regimes there as well. So through their militias and stuff like that. But it's gotten to a point where I think everyone should realize the threat Iran poses to the world, and that if this conflict right now creates the conditions for Iran to cause less harm around the world, including Ukraine, that would be a good thing.
You mentioned there that Iran might be looking for assistance with its nuclear program from Russia, potentially. How willing do you think Russia would be to help Iran develop that, should it be targeted by Israel?
I don't think Russia is too afraid of what Israel can deliver. You have had some Israeli politicians say, we have to take care of our immediate neighborhood right now, and then we're going to deal with you, Russia. So that will be interesting to watch. But look, we all know that Russia is heavily sanctioned, so is Iran. They both need each other desperately, and Russia does have the nuclear technology. It's building a nuclear reactor, possibly two, in Turkey right now, earning billions of dollars. So Russia is not in a good state economically. I think it could probably think up of great barter deals to do with Iran to give them more access to nuclear technology, in return get the resources that it needs, especially to press ahead with its war in Ukraine.
And just on another point, how do you see relations between North Korea and Russia at the moment? Because reports are emerging that 6 North Korean soldiers have been killed alongside Russian troops in Ukraine. Is the DPRK willing to commit to an alliance with Russia in a way that China perhaps isn't?
Yeah, I think so. The DPRK doesn't have many friends around the world, and I think the leadership of North Korea and of Russia have a heck of a lot in common, and they could also assist each other. So I don't think the killing of these soldiers is going to change very much, if anything, but that that relationship will continue to flourish. And again, it should be a reminder to the West of what kind of leader Mr. Putin is, that he has to seal friendships and deals with these horrific other leaders to get what he wants, to keep his economy afloat.
Just to touch on how you might envisage the war actually coming to an end in Ukraine. There's a peace summit for the war in Ukraine likely to be held after the US elections, hosted by Saudi Arabia, likely. Of the countries positioning themselves at the moment as significant diplomatic players or peace brokers, who do you see as the most influential? Is it Saudi Arabia? Is it Turkey? Is it China? Or do they all have a role to play?
Well, to answer that question, let's get one thing out of the way, okay? If, again, as I said in Hong Kong, Mr. Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia have met dozens of times already. So they have quite the bond, quite the friendship going on. But let's not kid ourselves. In this relationship, Mr. Xi Jinping is the very, very senior partner. So I think if he called Mr. Putin today or tomorrow and said enough is enough, stop the war, Mr. Putin would have no choice. That's how influential China is. In regards to a peace summit, I think it would be a good idea to have another one. I don't think much came of the first one in Switzerland. A big reason for that was some key players were missing. So if Saudi Arabia were to host the next one, I suspect it'll come after the elections in the United States. They've insisted on Russia being at the table. If Russia is going to be at the table, China will also be there. Of course, Turkey will be there as well. So I think that's really, really important because, again, they have quite a bit of influence over Russia. Having said that, right now there's no meeting of minds in between what Ukraine has proposed and what Russia has proposed for the guns to become silent. Remind everyone quickly what Russia is demanding, and that is that it holds on to Crimea, it holds on to Luhansk and Donetsk and two other oblasts as well, that it also is insisting that Ukraine drop its path to membership of NATO and other Western alliances. And then it's also talking about some kind of demilitarized zone with peacekeepers that it could probably easily manipulate. So the Ukrainians have rejected that outright. They actually are demanding a return of all of the territory Russia has seized, including Crimea. So we're in a very, very difficult position right now. Having said that, all of that, if you were to ask me what the mood in Ukraine is right now,
that was my next question, actually. Yes,
a real sense of weariness, and people, I think, are feeling there's been enough bloodshed. I mean, I think I've told you before, I do visit some of these military cemeteries, especially the one in Lviv, and they're basically running out of space. There are so many men coming back from the front line, either killed in action or very, very severely wounded. Ukraine just doesn't have the numbers that Russia does to throw this war. So a lot of people, I think, inside and outside Ukraine are nearing the realization, and I know this is a controversial thing to say, but I'm just repeating what I'm hearing, is that Crimea may be gone forever. When it comes to the Donetsk region, of which Russia has, I believe it's about 30% or something like that, it's also in very, very rough shape. Even before the war, it was an economic basket case there, but it's been so heavily destructed, so heavily mined, that one wonders what the economic viability of that would be should it return. And then also, Russia has done a lot to relocate ethnic Russians to these territories, to convert them kind of to Russian territory. But in no way should any country like Ukraine give up its territory if it was unprovoked attacked by a party like Russia. Look at the bad precedent that would set. Look at the signal that would give to other dictators from around the world. What is it okay to just come in and take territory? So it's a very, very tricky situation. And then one more thing is that whatever happens, whatever deals are made, there's going to have to be a credible guarantor, whether that's a guarantor of peace, whether that's Turkey or China or Saudi Arabia or a group of them, because if Russia does not honor its commitments and comes back in, they will be on the hook at the end of the day to defend Ukraine, and could be a great cost, not only financially but also boots on the ground as well. One final point, if I may, there's been a lot of research done on what the cost would be if Mr. Putin is not pushed back, and defense spending would increase exponentially for Western countries back to Cold War levels, and that's a figure a lot of Western countries just can't afford. So a lot of kind of factors to take into account here, balls in the air right now, but let's see what happens at this summit. I think it's actually a good thing that the Ukrainians and the Russians will be at the same table together potentially. At the beginning of the war, they actually were meeting in places like Turkey. So I think these contacts could be useful. Maybe they'll just produce more exchange of POWs, but maybe they'll also result in, for example, all of those Ukrainian children that were forcibly taken into Russia being returned as well.
And just finally, Michael, I mean, as a man of Ukrainian heritage who lives in Ukraine, who does a lot of traveling, you're currently on a tour where you've been to several different countries and you've seen both sides of the world on this one, New York, and also now you are, where are you now? You're in Bangkok, right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, what is the one message that you think the world needs to have from someone like yourself about Ukraine? What would you like to get out there?
Well, let me put one factoid out there, a couple. The Ukrainian government has now documented no less than 140,000 cases of war crimes in Ukraine by the Russians. Recently, there were 16 Ukrainian POWs killed by the Russians while they were in Russian hands. That's the kind of people. That's the kind of people the Russians seem to be right now. Not seem to be, but actually are those that are in charge of this war from the Russian side. What's very hurtful for myself of Ukrainian heritage and a lot of Ukrainians is hundreds and hundreds of Ukrainian cultural sites, churches, museums, art museums have been destroyed or targeted by Russia. That's above and beyond maternity hospitals and children's hospitals. So it's very, very difficult for Ukrainians to be watching this up close. A lot of us feel that this is history repeating itself, that, in 32, 33, there was the Great Famine that was unleashed on Ukraine by Russia. There was the liquidation of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. There were countless dissidents from Ukraine deported to the Soviet Gulag. But yet, Ukrainians continue to fight. They know how important their independence, their sovereignty is, their ability to protect their own land, which they fought for so hard. But they also realize that Russia is a very, very aggressive state that won't stop. And we should also remember what Mr. Putin said a few months before the war in that rambling 5,000-word essay, is that he said Ukraine is part of Russia, we're the same people, and there's no way that the two nations can be apart. I'll end this answer, if I can, with a short video clip that was circulating for a few months now, and it was of a young boy, and he had witnessed some of the atrocities, the bombing that had happened in Bucha and elsewhere, churches targeted, things like that. And he was asked, well, look, aren't you afraid? Aren't you afraid of where things go? And he goes, no, because we're Ukrainians, we are fighters, and we are brave. And I think that goes for all Ukrainian people, whether they've remained in Ukraine or they're overseas right now, is that that's who they are inside. And they will continue to fight with or without Western support. But a lot of them, Kate, feel right now is that they're defending democracy, not only Ukrainian sovereignty, as a kind of buffer state between the West and Russia. And they can't scream loudly enough to say that, look, trust us, if we don't stop Mr. Putin right now, he will come further. So that's why we need your help as well.
Michael Bociurkiw, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.